And I will add, the last thing I will say is that they also did the same thing with special education. So they do have, like I said, a sizable special education population, and the special education specialists pulled students also out of the learning lab, but again in a slightly different way. Rather than pulling, let's say, a group of 3 to 4, they would pull a group of 6 to 8 and take them maybe next door, and half the kids would be working on computer programs that were specialized to special education students and to their learning needs, while the other half worked with the teacher, and then they rotated. So again, it was a different way to do what they were doing already, but it was a more efficient way because they didn't have to go all over the building and get kids and things like that. They had more built-in efficient rotations because the students were right there. So, like I said, lots of different things you can say about First Line, but that's kind of the twist, I think, that the spin, what made it their own.
Cheryl, are they seeing any better integrations of data across the various modalities as they move to a blended model?
That's a really great question. But I would say I think the highest level answer, and I'm not going to be, I will generalize across the 5, is data integration is still an enormous challenge. I mean, really, and I mean that both in terms of integration from one program to the other. And First Line, I would say, of the cohort probably uses the most different programs for their kids. So they have to think about integration just of all the digital content information. That's a challenge. But even the idea of integrating the online data with what they learn from offline assessments is also, and that's not unique to First Line, that's a challenge, I think, across the space. I don't know.
Yeah. I think there are a couple really logical hurdles to that. One, the online content, if you're in a Common Core state, the online content's starting to map to those Common Core standards, and that's going to be really helpful. However, when you're a teacher, the Common Core standards are sort of at the summary level, and so they're starting to need micro standards for the most part as a teacher, and so we need the online content to not only go to the Common Core standards, but then also do micro standards potentially, really think about the summative way to report the data as well as sort of breaking it down. And if you're not in a Common Core state, that can be extra hard because the online content provider may not have an incentive to map to your standards. They may want to map just to the Common Core and higher economies of scale. And then the second sort of way to think about this, if you're a school operator, is I really need that data transfer to happen. So do I find 1 or 2 really great online content providers that get like 80% of what I'm trying to do for the most part pretty well? And then do I work with them to backwards map the infrastructure, the learning management system that would get their data out and to my teachers in a really user-friendly way? Or do I build the whole thing from the ground up and say, how do my teachers like to look at data? We use some sort of glorified Excel sheet or something like that, and then give that to online content providers and say, hey, can you figure out a way, to either get the data to me or something like that. So everyone's approaching this from a variety of different directions at the same time. Again, another potential place for all of us as operators, policymakers, et cetera, to think about where we can and want to play in this space, because it's not just in the school operating model. There's a huge data infrastructure, data information, online content place where we can play as well. And because it really, the true value of this is when the data comes in a full circle. It comes to the teachers and it goes back from the teachers to the online content.
I think that covers it. It's definitely one of the biggest challenges, though, ongoing challenges.
Yeah. So we can pause, we have another like half an hour, 25 minutes. We can continue to go through the examples, which is totally fine. I just wanted to make sure, do people have questions they wanted to pose to one another, more discussion format, or we can continue to go through the examples?
What's the teacher-student ratio for this case study?
For within the learning lab itself, or within, okay, so the learning lab I want to say was about 60 to 1. And but there with a couple of caveats. So there was actually not a certificated teacher that was the owner of the lab. It was what they called a learning lab monitor. Yeah. And that was not that person is not necessarily a certified teacher, but they're in charge kind of like overall lab management, right? So making sure that the kids, have what they need. That someone asked the question about order and classroom management. That's kind of this person's job. And then the classroom teachers and the special education teachers would come in and pull students out. And that would flex really depending on what the particular profile, right, of the kids were.
Yeah, but in the traditional classroom, there were 30 students, and then there were 2 classes at a time doing their learning lab. But as Cheryl pointed out, not all the students are necessarily sitting in the learning lab. But it does bring up, I think, an overarching point about how blended learning changes your human capital model and requires and/or allows, depending on how you look at it, a more differentiated staffing structure where you don't necessarily need everybody who's doing instructional work to be a certificated teacher. And so the models handle that differently, but you wouldn't necessarily want your a certificated teacher to be the learning lab monitor. The skills required aren't necessarily that level.
Let me just tell you why I asked the question, because speaking more on a higher education level, which is a little bit different, obviously, but still dealing with high school students through dual credit, the greatest success that we've had with online has clearly been where the students are in a computer lab with not necessarily the teacher, but somebody skilled enough to help the student. And by far, those students outperform any college online student that I know of. I mean, not to the person, but for the most part, as a group, because you've got the immediate help. And that's why I was just wondering in terms of the ratio,
Right.
And what kind of help is provided there, because the help is key to success with the online. Not speaking about blended, that's kind of just
Sure.
speaking about the online component.
No, I think that's a great point. And I think different models address the question of who should be the adult in the room very differently. And I don't just even mean, and that's true of the 5 models here, but I also think it's true of different blended learning models. So I think it's fair. So in other words, I think where you see in K-12 something that more closely mirrors what you're talking about is in what's called a flex model. And so that is where it's a situation where the digital content is actually expected to carry most of the load in terms of instruction. But the teachers, the adults in the room then, so to speak, are looking at dashboards and things like that to understand which students are struggling and which students need help. And they will pull small groups together, right, which is maybe a little bit closer to what you're talking about. And so you staff for that very differently, because in that case, you may be staffing certificated teachers, and you may be staffing teachers that are content experts, especially at the high school level, maybe, to be able to work with those students. I think, I think the role of online learning in models that are station rotation may be a little bit different, right? So the online learning is a supplement to the teacher-led instruction, whereas I think in the flex model, it's more, errs a little bit more on the replacement side, and therefore the question of who should be running those small groups is probably different. But you're right, it is an important question from a human capital perspective as to who that person should be.
Is there any comparison data between before and after blended learning in terms of student success? College attendance, AP?
Yeah, so that's a great question. There's not a whole lot yet, so I'll speak broadly in the field. There's not a whole lot yet in K-12 on blended learning. Hasn't been around just for too many years. I mean, I don't know what sake of argument, 4 to 5 years. So there's not yet been time, I don't think, for a lot of the longitudinal studies that you're talking about. So having said that, the second component for us was to have SRI look at all of these schools in comparison to a control group, and that's an analysis that's ongoing. And so I think there are different studies that are happening in different parts of the country that are starting to bite off the question, because really it's getting at this question of, is this more effective? Is this as effective? Is it always true, or is it more true for some kids than others? I think those are all hugely important questions, and the very long-winded way of saying not a whole lot yet that we know empirically. I think I don't know if they'll want to.
Yeah, I think that's right, because it is relatively new.
Yeah.
Cheryl, just make follow up on that from a colleague of Cheryl's and Kat's, but probably some of the best analysis to date that's been published is the New York information on those models, would you say? Like, where would you point people in terms of evaluative studies that talk about impact?
I'm not sure that. So you're talking about the school one?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was a fairly short-term study, but there have been 2 studies now done on School of One, both of which had a comparison group. But I think there's a lot of caveats attached to both studies, and rightly so, about it being super early and it was a very short time frame in terms of the amount of data. Past that, I don't know if anyone else has great information on this and wants to jump in, please feel free.
I think if you look up the School of One data and you also just look up SRI, the Research Institute out of Palo Alto is probably doing the most blended research. Cheryl's much smarter and thoughtful on this. I'm an operator, so for me, research means a different thing. But I think a lot of times, you know, a lot of times people are looking at rapid prototyping, action-based research. I mean, things trying to get to our point of proof points. You know, what can 1 year of data tell you? Not that much. But we do need it in order to decide what we're going to do as far as proof points. We don't want to scale this across the world without really thoughtful research. At the same time, we want to do some action-oriented, rapid prototyping research. So I think blended learning is in that place right now, where people are trying to figure out, okay, how big do we need to make this research? Should we make this research before we do something else? Can some of this be action-oriented? So I think between School of One and then SRI is really where everyone's kind of migrating to, probably has some of the best thought in it.
Other general questions? You guys want to go back? More case study examples, or is there a different direction?
So I have a question about across the case studies in terms of whether you saw with the fidelity to the models or implementation between doing it on the entire school for just one grade level or within 1 or 2 of the content areas, and if you saw any variation in the quality.
Well, we weren't doing that. So the SRI is doing the evaluative piece, so we weren't really looking at, you know, there wasn't really a way to gauge quality differences, or that's not what we were focused on. There was certainly, you know, differences in how it was implemented. And I wouldn't say fidelity to the model, because I think all of these schools really developed their own model, but there are certainly, you know, schools that were doing it, you know, the rocket ship school we looked at was starting with grades 1 to 3 and then was going to 4th and 5th, so you've got, you know, kind of growing into it there versus converting the whole school at one time. I don't know that it, you know, made a huge difference, but it really depends on, you know, a lot of other factors operationally and financially how you implement it. So, you know, different folks are going to want to do it different ways, just depending on where they start from.
Yeah, I think it goes back to the question. So, you know, what question are you trying to answer? And so I think 2 really good polar opposites, and like we often have polar opposite in a room, so I can say this comfortably. You know, if you're a rocket ship education, you're a K-5 charter management organization that came out of the gates a blended charter management organization to eliminate the achievement gap, but to do so with complete financial sustainability from day 1. So you had an academic goal and you had a financial goal. And you wanted to eliminate the achievement gap, which means you wanted to do it at scale. You wanted to do it fast. So they decided to convert, they came out of it, they hired people with that North Star in mind, so they had a certain approach and that was how they were going to do it. Your summit prep, which is, we can skip to summit because it's an interesting case study, your summit prep, you're what's kind of in the CMO world, you're like a mixed zip code school, you've got affluent students as well as low income students working together, closely aligned with Stanford School of Education, very thoughtful charter management organization, very thoughtful about the way they do everything, very anti-blended when the hype came out, in the middle of Silicon Valley, but anti-blended. This is not, we're not doing this for financial purposes. You know, we are an academic institution, phenomenal school, decided to put their toe in the water and did so with Khan Academy only if they could get this blended infrastructure, this data inquiry loop that we were talking about that a lot of schools are struggling, only if they could master that from day 1 as much as possible and completely customize the instruction online so that it was exactly and precisely connected with the teachers. As a result, they dipped their toe in the water and did it very slowly with a small group of students in one subject area. So that's an example of how different people are approaching this. But you really have to answer that question early on. What are you trying to do? Is it academic and operational? How disruptive do you want to be? And how are you, what is your culture and how does this make sense with your culture?